When unforeseen circumstances cause a naval ship to begin taking on water, the crew makes an unthinkable decision that just might save their lives. Now, please note that some of the descriptions and imagery presented in this story might be graphic and unsettling for some listeners, so viewer discretion is advised. With that said, I am your host, Uriah Baker, and welcome to Tales of the Clockwork. Ahmed Adanja loved the sea. From the time he was little, he and his father would routinely go fishing together. They would leave early in the morning, return with their catch by the afternoon, and then they would sell their fresh fish in the evenings at the local market. But it wasn't just the fishing or the quality time with his father that Ahmed really enjoyed. He found peace while at sea. So as he grew older, he would spend more and more time on the water, even when he wasn't fishing or dealing with the family business. When Ahmed turned 18, he joined the Royal Navy and quickly worked his way up through the ranks. At just 20 years old, Ahmed became the youngest captain in the history of the Royal Navy and took off on his 6th expedition on a ship called the Javelin. Now, these expeditions usually lasted several months, and this one was taking him and his crew to a place called the Falster Sea. With no military conflict in the last several years, these expeditions usually just consisted of maintaining the boundary lines between their territory and neighboring lands, as well as opening up communications with vessels that might be approaching the mainland. Now, for the first month of this expedition, everything had gone really smoothly, but one evening during the second month, the crew noticed that there were some dark clouds rolling in, and they knew that a storm would be coming through that night. Managing these storms wasn't anything new for the crew, but dealing with them through the night was particularly difficult just due to low visibility. The crew did have a protocol to follow during these storms, and Ahmed was in charge of making sure that all of the crew members were in the correct positions and were following their rotations as far as operating the bilges, navigating sails, and making sure that the rudders and other parts of the boat were not severely damaged. So early that evening, it began to rain as expected, and the waves started getting bigger and bigger, and finally by sunset, the Javelin was hit with a full-on storm. Over the next several hours, the crew did everything according to protocol to maintain the stability of the ship, as far as adjusting the sails, monitoring the main rudder for damage, and operating the manual bilge pumps that were on the ship. When the Javelin did have power, the vessel had 2 steam-powered bilges that would pump the water out of the boat. However, during some of these intense storms, the crew was required to operate the 8 manual bilge pumps that were on board in order to pump additional water out of the ship. After about 6 hours of navigating this storm, the entire crew was completely exhausted, and as a result, the vessel was starting to take on more water than it was able to pump out. At this point, the crew didn't think this was that big of a deal. The storm had already lasted pretty long. They figured it would be ending sometime soon, and they would be able to catch up with how much water they needed to pump out versus how much water they were taking in. Now, it wasn't very easy to operate one of these manual bilge pumps on the ship. The bilge systems had these large levers that crew members would have to constantly be rotating in order to pump water out of the ship. And while this was going on, they were being constantly tossed back and forth from the waves, which made their jobs that were already pretty difficult a lot harder. Over the course of the last 6 hours, members of the crew had been talking to each other about the situation, and despite years of experience, none of them had seen a storm quite as bad as this one, and some of them thought they knew why. During one of the rotations, several of the crew members came into Captain Ahmed's living quarters and explained to him a theory that this storm wasn't natural and was caused by something called a pep. Now, in order to get a better understanding of this theory, it's helpful to have some background on Egyptian mythology. This creature, Apep, was depicted as this large sea serpent, and although Apep was never formally worshipped as a god in Egyptian mythology, he was still regarded as this deity that rivaled the power of the gods and was associated of both being the god of chaos and disorder. Once the sun god Ra had established order on Earth, Apep vowed that he would destroy the order that was established and defeat Ra in the process. According to legend, every night when the sun left the earth and traveled to the underworld, Apep would begin lurking in the waters, waiting for Ra to make his return so that he could attack. While Ra would repel these attacks for a significant amount of time, Apep eventually found an opening during the First Great War of the Egyptian gods. During that war, Ra would actually be defeated by another god named Set, who was granted powers from Apep so that Set could use Apep's powers during the daytime. So with Ra no longer maintaining order, Apep was sort of left to roam free in the waters and was credited for causing a lot of natural disasters and storms. After hearing this, Ahmed sort of laughed at the idea that this storm could be caused by some sort of creature and basically tells them, look, we're all exhausted, we just need to keep doing what we're doing, ride out the storm. I know we're already taking on water, but we're getting close to being caught up. It's not quite a big deal yet, so let's just keep going and we'll figure it out as we go. Now, the crew started to argue with him a little bit, but when Ahmed told them very sternly to get out, they did. But when the next crew rotation took place on the boat, another set of crew members found themselves in Ahmed's office telling him the exact same thing. Ahmed looked at them and said, listen, I already talked to the last group about this. I know we're tired. We're almost through this storm. Let's just keep going. The crew members all looked at each other and told Ahmed, look, we have some bad news. The ship before was taking on water, but now it was taking on significantly more water than they were physically able to pump out, just because of how tired and exhausted the crew was of working all the way through the night. They informed Ahmed that based on their best guesses, they had maybe 2 or 3 hours left before the javelin began to sink. Ahmed is a little frustrated at this point, and he tells the members of his crew, look, I don't want to hear about Apep anymore. Get some rest while you can and get back to work on things. I'm helping out during the build rotations too sometimes. We will figure this out as we go, but we're not going to deal with this Apep thing anymore. So his crew members do leave and return to their posts, but time after time over the next several rotations, several more crew members come in and just keep talking to him about Apep. Eventually, the crew members come into his quarters and are yelling so loudly over the top of each other that Ahmed can't even figure out why they're yelling. Once the crew members quiet down, one of them speaks up and tells him that they think they have a potential solution to surviving this storm, and that solution is called a banishing ritual. During these banishing rituals, priests in the temple of the sun god Ra would build these large serpent-like figures. They would use ropes to hold this snake figure on top of a large T-shaped cross, and they would set the entire structure on fire. Once it was completely burned, the ashes would then be blessed by a priest and scattered throughout the water in order to ward off the powers of Apep. The crew members explained to Ahmed that they believed that a cultist of Apep was aboard their ship, conjuring his powers, causing this massive storm. At this point, Ahmed does start to realize that the members of his crew are right, that they are taking on water faster than they're physically able to pump it out, and it would probably only be a matter of hours before the javelin started to sink. So after some deliberation, Ahmed agrees to conduct this banishing ritual. And despite being pretty skeptical still, he began to pray to Ra and ask that he guide them in revealing which crew member was a cultist of Apep aboard their ship. So Ahmed shaved some pieces of wood from a plank in his quarters and cut them all into evenly sized pieces, with the exception of one. He even made more planks than there were members of his crew, just in case Ra determined that nobody on their ship was actually a cultist. He then sent orders for his crew to come see him during the next rotation. When the first group arrived, they all pulled pieces of wood from this container and revealed their length. And a man by the name of Saeed Jakar would be holding the short stick. The main room instantly turned to chaos. The crew members started to back Saeed into a corner, and he turned to Ahmed and began yelling to him, "It's not me, I'm not the cultist, I have nothing to do with this storm, you have to help me." But Ahmed just looked at him and said that he was sorry. The crew members in the room surrounded Saeed and they began to beat him relentlessly before they tied his arms and legs together and dragged him to the main room on the lower deck. Now, this main room was mostly enclosed and the floor was made of metal, which they figured would be the perfect surface for their ritual. Once Saeed was dropped off in the room, crew members began running all throughout the ship, ripping and cutting off pieces of wood from the interior so that they could use that to build a small wooden pillar, similar to those that the priests used during their banishing rituals. Now, the entire time this is going on, Saeed is yelling and screaming on the floor that it isn't him, it has to be someone else. He has no idea why this storm is happening. They have the wrong person, but nobody is listening to him. Eventually, one of the crew members is so fed up with listening to him scream and yell that they just take a piece of cloth and wrap it around his mouth. Once the crew members had gathered enough wood, they tied the planks together, making a large pole in the center of the room. 3 different ropes were then attached to the top of this pole and were sort of stretched out and held by crew members so that they would be able to support it from the bottom and the pole wouldn't fall over. Once the pole was in position, they dragged Saeed to the base of the pole and they began saying a prayer to Ra to bless their banishment of Apep from the waters. Everyone in the room began to chant this prayer over and over again. While everyone is doing this chant, 2 more crew members approach Saeed and hold him down, while another one approaches him and draws a large knife. The crew member drove the knife into Saeed's stomach and began pulling out his insides. Members of the crew could see Saeed visibly screaming, but they weren't even able to hear him over the sounds of the chanting and the storm that was still going on outside. They then took his insides and strung them up across the top of this pillar so it would resemble that of a serpent like it would in the original banishing rituals done by the priests. Once everything was in position, the crew set this on fire in the middle of their boat and began to chant as the fire burned. The crew let this fire burn for as long as they thought they could before significantly damaging the ship more than they already had. After the fire was extinguished, they took the pole and the remains of Saeed's body to the main deck and threw it overboard. And to Captain Ahmed's surprise, soon after they dumped the remains of Saeed into the sea, the storm died down. The rain stopped, and the waters were completely calm. And the crew didn't experience another storm for the remainder of their expedition. Nobody knows for certain if it was the ritual that stopped this storm, or if it was just some sort of weird coincidence. After the events that took place on the Javelin during this expedition, the ship ended up being decommissioned, and Ahmed was reassigned as the captain of a new naval vessel called the Misty Anchor.